We live in this really unique era where you can literally download 1,000 hours of lectures to your phone right now.
Oh, yeah. Easy.
Right. Like you can listen to the greatest thinkers in the world while you're, I don't know, folding your laundry, or you can read these brilliant treatises while commuting to work.
Which is amazing, but it creates a bit of a trap.
Exactly. There is this subtle modern assumption that access to information automatically equals transformation. Like if you just consume enough data, if you read enough books, you will just inherently become a better person.
Yeah, that's the illusion, isn't it?
It really is. And the source document we are diving into today, it's a comprehensive paper titled 019, Fully Rooted in Build, up.pdf, and actually points out a massive flaw in this modern habit.
It does. The author makes a pretty bold argument that we are basically drowning in information, but entirely starving for actual transformation.
Yeah. So our mission today, for you listening, the ultimate learner, is to objectively unpack this text. We want to find out how it answers one central, quiet, but incredibly pressing question for its target audience of Christian believers, which is, what does genuine spiritual maturity actually look like?
Right, and we're going to explore how the document maps out a path that goes, way beyond just intellectual belief. The text provides this framework for a holistic life, one that the author claims must be shaped by truth, character, and action all at once. It's entirely focused on bridging that massive gap between knowing a concept in theory and actually embodying it in practice.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Because the core problem the text diagnoses is what it calls information discipleship.
That's a great term for it.
It is. It highlights this tension in modern faith communities where individuals accumulate all these teachings. They go to the seminars, they take meticulous notes, but they completely struggle to live any of it out.
Yeah, there's a disconnect there.
I was thinking about it like this. I mean, binge-watching cooking shows doesn't actually make you a master chef.
Oh, absolutely not.
Right. Like you can watch 5 seasons of a baking competition. You can know exactly what a proper ganache looks like on a cellular level. But if you don't actually get in the kitchen, crack some eggs, and, probably burn a few things.
You aren't a chef.
Exactly. You're just a highly informed spectator.
The kitchen analogy captures that gap between theory and practice really well. But the text actually takes it a step further. It describes this exact phenomenon as a fragmented spiritual life.
Fragmented, okay.
Yeah. According to the author, what happens is people become highly developed in one specific area, but they remain completely underdeveloped in others, which creates severe structural instability.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, you might have someone who has deep doctrinal knowledge, like they can debate complex theology for hours, but they lack basic patience or kindness or empathy.
Wow. Yeah, we've all met that guy.
Right. In this framework, their character is stunted. Or conversely, the document points to people who serve their community passionately, always volunteering and giving.
Yeah, which is great.
It is. But their theological foundation is so weak that when a real crisis hits, their worldview simply collapses. Because, well, it has no root system.
It's like they have all the individual pieces of the puzzle, but they are trying to force them together without looking at the picture on the box.
Exactly. And the solution the text introduces to fix this fragmentation is the ongoing, simultaneous convergence of 3 inseparable realities.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, doctrine, which the author defines as truth that forms the mind. Second, character, which is the transformation of the heart. And third, obedience, which is the mechanism that actually directs the life.
Truth, heart, and action.
You're right. The argument is that they absolutely must operate together.
Wait, I want to push back on that a little bit.
Sure.
Because it sounds neat and tidy on paper, but can a person truly possess Christ-like character if their foundational doctrine is, completely skewed, or vice versa?
That's a fair question.
I mean, we all know people who have zero theological doctrine. Maybe they aren't even religious, but they are incredibly kind, generous, and patient. How does the text account for them? Does it claim you absolutely must have this specific doctrine to be a quote-unquote good person?
That is a really crucial distinction to make. The text is not talking about general human goodness or basic civic decency.
Okay.
It is specifically defining character as a sustainable, integrated reflection of Christ. The author argues that separating these dimensions distorts faith, making it ultimately unstable.
Interesting.
The underlying mechanism here is that ideas shape reality. What a person fundamentally believes about the nature of God dictates how they treat people over the long term.
Ah, I see.
Like, if a specific doctrine teaches that God is a harsh, unforgiving taskmaster, human psychology suggests that person's character will inevitably become harsh and unforgiving toward others, regardless of how many good deeds they perform.
Okay, so the doctrine provides the architectural blueprint for the character.
Yes, exactly. And on the flip side, if someone has deep doctrine but no obedience, the text calls that intellectual faith that lacks transformation.
Because they aren't doing anything with it.
Right. It's unstable because it is entirely theoretical. The three dimensions, doctrine, character, and obedience, have to grow together because they actively feed each other. Doctrine gives you the map, character provides the internal desire to follow it, and obedience is the physical act of walking the path.
And without all three, the author claims genuine maturity simply doesn't happen.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the text doesn't just leave us with abstract concepts like doctrine and character. It brings in these two incredibly vivid metaphors to explain how this growth actually happens mechanically.
Yeah, drawing from the Apostle Paul's imagery in Colossians.
Right. Chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. The imagery focuses on being rooted and built up in Him.
What's fascinating here is how the text breaks down Paul's combination of two completely different worlds to make his point. Agriculture and architecture.
Two very different things.
Very different. First, you have the agricultural metaphor of roots. Roots represent the organic, unseen life. In a biological sense, they perform highly specific, critical functions.
Right, they anchor the plant.
They anchor it in the soil, they absorb water and nutrients, and importantly, they store resources to create resilience for future droughts or storms.
Stuff you never actually see.
Exactly. You never see the roots, but the deeper they go, the stronger the tree. The text argues that the visible health of a believer is entirely dependent on this hidden work below the surface.
Okay, I get that.
Hmm.
But I'm struggling to see how building a house and growing a tree aren't totally contradictory ideas here.
How so?
Well, one is completely natural and organic. The other is entirely manufactured. How does the source reconcile doing both at the same time?
That tension is exactly the point the author is trying to make.
Really?
Yeah, the root system keeps the tree alive, but roots alone just give you a healthy plant. They don't provide shelter or a place for others to live.
Oh, wow.
That is why the text argues you have to construct something, which brings us to the architectural metaphor. Being built up is structural and intentional.
Right. You don't accidentally build a house by just standing in a field and waiting.
Exactly. A building requires instruction, discipline, careful measurement, and perseverance. It is a deliberate layering, brick by brick. So the organic growth provides the life source, while the architectural discipline provides the usable structure.
You know, it reminds me of a city's infrastructure.
Yeah.
If you look at a massive skyscraper, the roots are the underground water pipes, the electrical grids, the massive foundation pylons driven like hundreds of feet deep into the bedrock.
Right.
Nobody sees them. Nobody takes photos of the pylons for social media. But if they aren't there, the building falls over the second the wind shears hit it.
That's a perfect analogy.
But the building itself, though, is the conscious daily choices we make that everyone does see. The glass, the steel, the architecture. What this document claims is that spiritual maturity requires both. The hidden organic grounding with God and the visible intentional construction of daily habits.
And the text gets very specific about how an individual actually cultivates those hidden roots. It dives into what it calls the hidden engine of growth, which is the daily devotional life.
Okay, the engine.
Yeah.
How does that work?
The mechanics of this engine are fourfold: scripture meditation, prayer, worship, and silence. This is the underground work.
Up a rock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The source provides biblical case studies to illustrate that this isn't presented as optional. It points to King David establishing a deliberate rhythm of dependence by seeking God early in the morning. It highlights Daniel, who maintained a strict rhythm of praying 3 times a day, even under severe political threat.
Right, he was literally facing the lions.
Yeah. Exactly. The mechanism of Daniel's devotion wasn't dependent on his circumstances being comfortable. It was a fixed infrastructure. And ultimately, it points to Jesus himself, who constantly withdrew to solitary places to pray.
Even when everyone was looking for him.
Right. Effectively prioritizing the hidden root system, even during the absolute busiest, most demanding seasons of his public ministry.
But then, the text takes a bit of a turn.
Sure.
It emphasizes that this hidden devotion is vital, but it also claims that character isn't formed in comfort alone. It brings up the crucible of testing.
The crucible, yes.
And I have to admit some confusion here. Wait, I gotta ask though. Why does the author insist that trials are the absolute workshop of spiritual formation?
It's a tough concept to swallow.
It is. Can't someone just grow in peace? If an individual is doing the quiet time, reading the texts, and meditating, why is a painful crucible presented as a necessary mechanism for maturity?
It is a very natural human question to want the growth without the growing pains. But the text points to the book of James, chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, which notes that the testing of faith produces perseverance.
Okay.
The mechanism the author is describing here is essentially deprivation. Comfort allows us to rely on our own strength and external scaffolding.
We prop ourselves up.
Right. When you are thrown into a crucible, all your external support systems are stripped away. You are forced to see if your roots can actually find water when it hasn't rained.
Wow.
By removing comfort, the trial forces the believer to rely entirely on their foundational doctrine. It transfers it from a nice theological idea in their head to a functional survival tool.
So the trial acts as a stress test for the infrastructure. I mean, you don't actually know if a bridge can hold a 10-ton truck until you drive a 10-ton truck over it.
Exactly.
I can't learn patience when everything is going your way. Patience inherently requires a delay. You can't learn forgiveness unless you have actually been deeply wronged.
The text uses historical and biblical examples to prove this exact mechanism. Look at the narrative of Joseph in the Old Testament.
Sold into slavery by his own brothers.
Yes. Falsely accused of a crime, thrown into an Egyptian prison. According to the document, that severe crucible of isolation and injustice was the precise mechanism that forged the integrity he needed.
To eventually navigate immense political power without being corrupted by it.
You got it.
And the text doesn't just stick to ancient history to make this point either.
No, it brings it right into the modern era. It analyzes figures like Corrie ten Boom, who found profound spiritual resilience and the capacity to forgive while suffering unimaginable horrors in a Nazi prison.
Unbelievable strength.
It also mentions Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who maintained incredible peace in character under the tyranny of the Third Reich. When Bonhoeffer was in a prison cell, the text argues his roots were tested because he had absolutely no comfort to rely on.
You had to rely on the hidden engine.
Yes. These trials are where spiritual muscle memory is built. The crucible is the fire that tempers the steel, turning theoretical doctrine into lived, unshakable character.
Okay, so we have the hidden roots of devotion, the structural building of daily obedience, and the crucible that tests and tempers it all. But the text makes it clear that in this framework, none of this is meant to just stay locked inside the individual.
No, not at all.
We have to look at how that internal reality inevitably breaches the surface and impacts the surrounding world.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author argues that maturity is never just a private phenomenon. The text notes that Jesus didn't come to be served, but to serve.
Right.
The logical conclusion presented is that if a person is genuinely becoming more like him, their life will inherently become more service-oriented. Their gaze will shift outward.
It's like a sponge.
A sponge.
Yeah. True spiritual maturity in this context is like a sponge that has been sitting in a bucket of water. Once it's fully saturated with grace, any pressure applied to it, whether that's a difficult conversation at work, a family crisis, or just the mundane demands of daily life, it will physically cause it to leak that grace onto others.
That makes sense.
Because you can't help but squeeze out what you entirely filled with.
The sponge is a helpful visual for the overflow, for sure, but the document actually pushes that concept further. It is not just about leaking grace when passively squeezed by circumstances. It's about actively seeking out places that are dry.
Oh, I see.
And that is how the text transitions into its view of evangelism. What is important to note is how the text redefines evangelism for its readers.
Because it can be a loaded word for some people.
Very much so. It is not presented as a forced religious quota, an awkward sales pitch, or an aggressive argument. The author describes it as the organic outpouring of gratitude, compassion, and confidence in the gospel.
Just a natural result.
Right. When an individual is profoundly grateful for the transformation in their own life, sharing it becomes a natural consequence. The mechanism driving it is compassion for others, not a forced obligation to meet a metric.
And the document strongly argues that you don't do any of this alone. It is very clear that isolation fundamentally breaks the mechanism of growth.
Yes, community is huge here.
It uses the early church in Acts chapter 2 as the ultimate blueprint for this. The text points out that they devoted themselves to teaching, to fellowship, and to the breaking of bread. They shared their lives.
Community is presented as the mandatory context for all this growth. The underlying mechanism of community is both friction and support.
Friction and support, yeah.
You need other people to bump up against to test your character, and you need them to hold you up when your roots are weak. The text specifically highlights the need for small groups, mentorship, and accountability to accelerate this maturity.
It points to Barnabas and Paul, right?
Yes, the historical relationship between Barnabas and Paul. Barnabas mentored Paul, actively advocating for him when the rest of the church was terrified of him because of his past.
Which is understandable, given his past.
Very true. But the text suggests that every believer needs a Barnabas to help them navigate the structure of faith. And eventually, they need to become a Barnabas to someone else.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? If we understand the goal of the text's holistic discipleship and the process roots, building, crucible, and community, how does the author suggest you actually track your progress without falling back into some rigid, legalistic checklist mentality?
Well, the text offers a very practical, forward-looking diagnostic. It warns its readers about a psychological phenomenon it calls the post-intensive fade.
Oh, I think anyone who has ever attended a conference or read a self-help book knows this one well.
It is a universal human experience. This is when someone goes to a great weekend retreat, reads a deeply inspiring book, gets totally fired up, and then completely loses all momentum 2 weeks later when the friction of normal life hits.
Yeah, the motivation just evaporates.
Exactly. To combat this fade, the author explains the absolute necessity of a deliberate 12-month post-intensive plan. The argument is that you need a conscious strategy to integrate these truths into your daily rhythms over the long haul, rather than relying on bursts of emotional motivation.
But how do you know if the plan is working? I mean, human beings are wired to want measurable results.
Yeah.
How does a person know if their root system is actually getting deeper?
This raises an important question regarding how to measure success in spiritual growth. And the text specifically warns against looking for fireworks or constant dramatic spiritual highs.
Because that's exhausting anyway.
Right. Real growth, according to this framework, is usually subtle, incremental, and quiet. The document provides 4 specific milestones for the reader to look out for.
Let's hear them.
First, is Scripture actively shaping your daily decisions? Not just reading it to check a box, but is it the actual lens through which you analyze choices?
Okay, that's a good check. Second, is prayer becoming an instinct rather than a scheduled chore? I found this one particularly fascinating.
How so?
Well, it's the difference between saying, I have to pray for 15 minutes at 7 a.m. versus getting a highly stressful email at 2 p.m. and your very first biological instinct before typing a defensive reply is to quietly ask for wisdom.
That instinctual turn is a massive milestone because it shows the doctrine has rewired the psychological response.
Yeah.
Third, are you handling conflict with grace and humility? The text points to leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela as examples of responding to intense conflict and systemic injustice with disciplined, grace-filled character.
Instead of just reacting.
Right. The mechanism here is that they didn't merely react with anger they were receiving, they responded from a deep, pre-established well of formed character.
The roots were showing.
Exactly. And finally, the 4th milestone. Is your faith being shared naturally in conversation without coercion? Does it just come up organically because it's deeply integrated into who you are?
To wrap this self-assessment up, the text brings in a command from the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 13.5, which is simply to examine yourselves. And it is crucial to note how the author frames this.
Yes, very crucial.
The text emphasizes this isn't meant to induce guilt. It's not about beating yourself up over where you fall short of the ideal. It is presented purely as a diagnostic tool to reveal blind spots so an individual can course correct and allow the process to work in those specific areas.
The author is framing it as an invitation to clarity, not an invitation to condemnation.
That's a great way to put it. Well, we've covered a significant amount of ground today. To synthesize this deep dive into the source text, true discipleship, according to this document, is moving from just acquiring information, from just downloading that software update or binge-watching those cooking shows, to engaging in a deeply integrated life where your doctrine, your character, and your obedience are growing simultaneously.
That's the core of it.
The author makes the case that it takes time, it takes incredible patience, and it requires enduring the crucible to let those hidden underground roots do their work.
And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building on the text's concept of multiplication.
Okay.
The document insists that true maturity is never meant to remain merely personal. It is fundamentally designed to be generational.
Generational, wow.
Yeah. So consider this. Based on the framework we just explored, what if the quiet, unseen, seemingly mundane habits you practice tomorrow morning are actually planting the seeds for a lineage? What if your private discipline in the dark today is shaping the character of generations you will never even meet, creating an architectural structure that outlasts your own lifetime?
Man, that completely changes the stakes of a quiet Tuesday morning. You can't just download this upgrade. You have to get in the kitchen, get your hands messy, and actually start cooking. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep digging, keep learning, and keep asking the hard questions.